I'd like to welcome you all to Airtime Seminar Series. My name is Karen Gundy-Burlett. I'm the director of the NAMS-2 contract through the NASA Academic Mission Services on through that contract, Crown Innovations in collaboration with University of California, CITRIS and Vantel Institute is holding a series of seminars on advanced aviation to share interesting research ideas on pertinent topics and innovative methodologies with the advanced air mobility and air traffic management communities. So the seminars will feature leading experts on cutting edge research, including a new AAM initiative by UC Berkeley to inspire innovation and collaboration. And major themes of the series will include multimodal integration, artificial intelligence and advanced aviation, autonomous intelligence in aviation, and hot topics in advanced aviation. And so Airtime speakers will initially be subject matter experts from UC Berkeley, Merced, Davis, and Santa Cruz, and it will be a once-a-week series starting today. So let us get started. I would like to introduce our first very eminent speaker, Dr. Alex Bayen. He is the director of CITRIS and the Vantel Institute, Lee Cho Innovation Endowed Chair, and professor of electrical engineering and computer sciences, and of civil and environmental engineering at UC Berkeley, and a founding associate provost for the Berkeley Space Center. He's also a faculty science and mechanical engineering at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory and has served as the director of the UC Berkeley Institute of Transportation Studies. He received an engineering degree in applied mathematics from École Polytechnique, France, and MS and PhD in Aeroastro from my alma mater, Stanford University. He was a visiting researcher at NASA Ames Research Center from 2000 to 2003. And he has worked as the research director of the Autonomous Navigation Laboratory at the Laboratoire des Recherches Balistiques et Aerodynamiques, where he holds in France, where he holds the rank of major. So at this point, I would like to welcome Alex and thank you very much for starting off our series.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, we're almost there from a technical standpoint. Maybe a quick sound check, because I don't know how I'm speaking to folks online. Is it through this mic or is it just there's some magical mics? The mic is here. Perfect. So if someone is online and doesn't hear me, I suppose someone's going to scream. And then how do we make sure that these people here see the slides? Oh, I see. Okay, perfect. Okay. Oh, wow. Great. Fantastic. Well, thank you, Karen, and team, Natalie and Victoriana and everybody for hosting me today. I think it's been 25 years since I've been in this building. It feels really good to be back. My office is empty. Georges Myers, I can see that even Kapil next door has been there for 27 years, also gone in another building.
He's in a different office.
Yeah, but I'm glad that the pictures are still there on the wall. They're the same pictures. In fact, I'm going to start. So before I start with that picture, and maybe there's a way to put this in screen share mode. Oh, yeah, this is your machine that lets you do that. So I think that my goal today is to start in this building in the late 90s when I was working here with George Meyer, Heinz Hatzberger, Kapil Sheth, Ganesh Chatterjee, Sean Graby, and Leighton Kwan, and PK. And then essentially take a long detour into the world of machine learning to land us where we are today, which is really at a very exciting time where we can use more recent advances of the field to see how they could be applied to air traffic control. Right now, you probably see interesting people around the table, and soon you'll see the slides. Okay, I can live with that if that works.
It's here. I'm going to put you over here.
It's good.
This is the camera here.
Great. Okay.
See you.
I'm not sure what you're seeing, but good morning.
Okay, well, yeah, it looks like it. Anyway, okay, so this, many years ago, many of you saw this movie, which is really what we were working on at the time, the early ages of Facet. I mean, you can tell by the interface, it's from another era. And this was absolutely fantastic as a first PhD student, and then later as a junior faculty to have access to ETNS data, ADS-B data, and a lot of other data sources for the work we were doing. And the work we were interested at the time was specifically, actually, this picture is still in front of our office on the second floor. So if you ever trash it, please, I'm happy to take it home. And so what we were doing at the time is we were extracting very specific inbound trajectories into SFO to understand how we could possibly use what at the time was really mostly commercial optimization and optimal control to sequence aircraft into descent airspace in safe manners. And so specifically, we took reduced versions of the Facet dataset, which at the time was really big, because it was really hard. The digital twins of the National Airspace System in the late 90s was quite challenging from a computational standpoint because there was no cloud, obviously, and you had to do this on dedicated platforms. And so if you were at the university, you were just taking a subset of this and trying to see how you could devise both a planning layer and a control layer on that traffic. So in the paradigm of the late 90s, and mostly dealing with en-route airspace and maybe descent airspace, the idea was to maybe work at the sector level and then across sectors at the center level with the regional airspace to see how to devise these maneuvers. And the new thing that had just come out at the end of the 90s was this framework of hybrid systems, which really lends itself nicely to air traffic control, because in hybrid systems, you essentially model a system in modes. Modes are perfect for aviation. For example, you could hold speed, you could have a minimum speed that below which you shouldn't be flying, max speed usually at cruise, detour, shortcut, hold. So typical holding pattern would be described by a mode in these models, and essentially it would be a rule of thumb of 1 minute, 1 minute, 1 minute, 1 minute. So you just lose 4 minutes on your flight plan. And then, or other things like a vector for spacing, which if you come a tiny bit too early, at the time, this was the resolution of the data. And this, again, lends itself very nice to this modal description. And you can switch from some modes to others, not to all modes. And the work we were doing then was really try to see how we can compose these for aircraft and come up with a simple description of the way a pilot thinks that is also compatible with the way an air traffic controller thinks, so we could devise algorithms at the planning level and the control level to manage these. And for a variety of reasons in the decades to follow, this kind of was forgotten a little bit, but now with the resurgence or the emergence of LLMs and Gen AI, it's also back in business because this is very, very close to modern languages. And so at the time, though, in the late 90s, the idea was a very control theoretic approach to the problem where you would think of a sector as a form of a plant in which you would have a bunch of dynamical systems, each in different modes that can interact with each other and with air traffic control. And you would think of air traffic on the ground as some form of optimizer, whether it's a system of human or system of humans that would have some form of objective, so usually minimize delays, obviously with very hard constraints, no conflict and safety, and then some other flow constraints in sector 17. I think here in our RC, I think the capacity was 13 because it was a very narrow sector and the local person in charge could not handle more than 13 flights at a time. So some form of optimization and some form of constraint. So this, in some ways, is inherited from the thinking of control theory in the late 90s that goes back all the way to maybe the 60s. And the nice thing is that these problems are usually easy to decompose conceptually with a planning layer and a control layer. So for the planning layer, you'd go to the infrastructure. So this is the descent I was just showing in the Facet data, but now that's from the Jepson maps. And the idea is that if you fly direct, you have some form of arrival time. But if you incur some voluntarily delay on the way, you essentially, for example, could delay your arrival by a little bit, and that gives you another possible set of landing times. And so that planning layer is very classical sequencing work that was done in classical OR, especially the early work at MIT in probably the early 90s. that was ready for operationalization with tools that were new at the time, like CPLEX and the Ample modeling framework, so that this could almost be run in real time. And so then the second part was, once you had done that sequencing, the second part was how you enforce safety, and you would do this in a hierarchical manner so that you would come up with some guarantees. And that's the whole work on the second floor. Michael Hyman, George Meyer, and earlier Claire Tomlin, when she was herself a student there, amounted to computing safe and reachable sets that would ensure that if you start a flight plan out of these, regardless of how antagonistic or problematic that aircraft could be, this one could always escape. So it's kind of this classical framework of differential games that goes back all the way to Richard Bellman and Rufus Isaacs, where essentially with the dogfight style approaches, you would always compute an escape maneuver, no matter how problematic the other aircraft would be. So if you lose communication, so this one, for example, here is trying to crash this guy, but there's always an escape maneuver because that optimal controller uses the solution to a Hamilton-Jacobi equation that provides guarantees of safety. And this is from my thesis and many other PhD students' thesis at the time, which was partially done in this building. And the idea is that you could implement this at the lower level. So we were the first one at the time to try this on ETMS data, and these are actually conflicting flight plans. And so the way you would do it is you would essentially come up with, they're not flying at the same altitude. So it's real data, but they're not really conflicting because we obviously didn't have some real crash or near crash data. But the idea is that you would demonstrate by just faking the altitude in the ETMS data that with the proper controller, you would sequence them properly, and then you would be able to differentiate their flight path in advice so that you would be outside of the 5 nautical miles safety radius. And in fact, this might have been the last test that was ever run on the runway behind us. My colleague Rodney Teo and his group within the hybrid systems lab at Stanford under Claire Tomlin flew. And so at the time they would actually build this. It's kind of crazy because now you just buy this in Radio Shack. But this was actually built in the lab, and essentially they would have one aircraft try to crash the other. So they landed it from the runway. And basically with this kind of hybrid systems framework, you would identify where you should keep one aircraft out of so that no matter what the other aircraft would do, you could try and intrude as much as you want, you would still not be able to do it. So this is, you probably, yeah, here we go. You can see where, I'm not sure we can do this anymore, but these were the good old times when you could do that. So then this happened, and we all remember that. That's September 11th. This is actually, I don't know if this was Facet or another tool to do that, but this is when they landed all the aircraft after the attack. And that completely changed paradigm because even in this building, the mood really changed. So it's kind of crazy, land all the aircraft. Initially, the vision was in the late 90s, everything's going to go decentralized, some functionality is going to get automated, and et cetera, et cetera. And of course, there was a big push back to centralization that came after September 11th. And this is when people's attention shifted, and that's the time when I started to work on other controls problem, leaving aviation for about a decade before coming back, and that's going to be the second part of the talk. So at the time, if you think now we're back in the mid-2000, the big thing that comes is the two things, Internet of Things, so connectivity of every possible device, and mobile internet. That was, so suddenly anybody working, I did feel this working in aviation, the research took a big dip, and my colleagues who were working in automotive felt the same exact dip. Suddenly all attention was back on mobile devices. And so our group completely changed focus from control into estimation. And one thing we were very proud of is that in 2008, we deployed the first traffic app ever deployed in North America to gather traffic from GPS-enabled smartphones. That's a phone, for those who don't remember what buttons look like. That's a Nokia phone. Nokia, you probably don't even know that name either, but that's the giant phone maker of the time, and they were the first ones to have GPS on both their devices. So we turned on arterial traffic 3 days before Google did with Nokia, and then they collapsed. But it was amazing that this is generated at Berkeley. It's not a screenshot of Google Maps. This is us rendering data in the entire Bay Area from smartphones. And within 2 years, gone from, this probably still exists, it's 511 because you can see it, essentially loop detectors into this. And so that enabled us to deploy a lot of algorithms to do estimation of distributed parameter systems, which we'll come back to when we come back to aviation a little bit later in the talk. Whoops, I think I messed up. Oh, no, perfect. So, okay. Then we continued with the swimming phones. So this is an example of other platform we built with smartphones in it in order to demonstrate that we can measure current. So if you think about measuring stream of traffic on a freeway, it's not that different than measuring river flow on a river. And so we were operating at the time in Georgia Slough, which is in the middle of the Sacramento Delta. There's about 1,000 miles of water channels that are tidally forced. And the idea is that how could you coordinate a bunch of agents to sample the water current and chemistry adaptively? So you can see we're not flying anymore, we're swimming, but it's the same idea of mobile control of multiple agents. So this was a very interesting and very popular thing amongst the students because they would have a lot of fun on the Delta. So essentially, we would just throw these things in the Delta. We had about 100 of them, and then they would just speak to us through the cellular network, and we could use that to reconstruct the particle flow on the water. So mostly estimation and a little bit of control, because obviously the force to fight the currents, I mean, the currents can go up to 2 meters a second in some channels. So it's like really fast. So it's very, very moderate actuation. So similar to an aircraft, cannot do like a helicopter move with some minimal control and a lot of sensing. Then we went on to earthquakes. So this is, we have shake tables at Berkeley that can reproduce any earthquake ever recorded in the state of California. So it was interesting to see, because now phones, this is iPhone 1, came with accelerometers. So we were trying to see whether we can use replays of earthquakes to use the phones themselves as a way to detect earthquakes where you don't necessarily have heavy infrastructure. And in fact, one of my colleagues, Richard Allen, now uses this, and the early warning system for California is built on users of phones, probably your phones if you opt in, that can produce these shake maps, and in some cases give you a couple seconds of early warning, which in the case of BART enables you to slow down from 70 miles an hour to maybe 30. That will definitely prevent a derailment that is a lot of fatalities, and then maybe enough time to run out of the building in some cases. So then we continued, and as the data was becoming more and more prevalent, we got more and more partnerships with companies. This is an example of a project with cap spotting, where we were using GPS data at the time to try to see if we can build a full control system to manage the entire infrastructure of the city. And the amazing thing is that with 500 vehicles sampled every 30 seconds, within a couple hours, you can build the entire city map. And just for reference, this is pre-Uber, but now Uber has 40,000 registered drivers. And Waymo is also going to graph that even by the order of magnitude. So this is the early ages now of the integration of the IoT inside the infrastructure. And so one project we did for the District 7 of the Department of Transportation of California, essentially integrate all of the traffic light infrastructure and use that data to manage the flow. You can see we're always hovering around aviation, but tackling different problems. They're limited actuation with a lot of sensing, or control of flow, but just with different dynamics and different constraints. Because again, these were not great years to lots of the research avenues in aviation were really doing a lot of soul searching. And so in some ways, that's why we stayed on the ground for a little bit longer. So this was deployed in 2015, fully operationalized, and enabled us to essentially manage all the 500 traffic lights along that corridor so we could improve traffic. And so there's a lot of flow control algorithms we came up with this. And it also enabled us to manage problems like if everybody's using Waze or Google or anything at the same time, you probably know, everybody knows now that it produces outcomes that are terrible because everybody's using the same exit. So you plug the exit, so now the travel time is higher. And so we were able to demonstrate a lot of possible remediation for this. This is an example of micro simulation. So for those who are not familiar with the lower modes of transportation, this is kind of the equivalent of Facet on the ground. There's many different versions of this. And it's very choppy on the screen, I'm sorry. But it's what we used in digital twinning in order to come up with such algorithms. Since then, I did join Google, and then for a couple of years, we worked on actually changing the Google app. And so if sometimes Google gives you a travel time that is 1 minute longer than the shortest, then you still have the choice to do both, but it strongly suggests that you should take the 1 minute hit. It's because we want to avoid these kinds of problems. And so this is, I'm not speaking on behalf of Google, I'm not working at Google anymore, but this is something that we have played with and worked really well. So that brings me to the second topic of today, which will get us back to aviation at the end of the talk, which is the topic of mixed autonomy. And mixed autonomy is a concept which is very prevalent on the ground, but which is also very prevalent in the air, in which some functionality of automation, for example, in a car, interacts with a completely human-driven thing. So think of your maybe some drone that doesn't have a pilot, or think of the autopilot of your 777 in cruise mode when the next aircraft is fully driven by human. So some level of automation, no automation. And so the thinking in the context of traffic was that this could be used very efficiently to improve traffic flow. And so now we're roughly in the mid-2010, and it's still not rebirth of complete crazy aviation research, so we're still on the ground. And there the time had come that with the emergence of the Gen 1 Tesla, and the fact that autopilots were becoming more and more effective at lane keeping and, of course, longitudinal control, we thought, why not try to see if we can coordinate across vehicles to manage the entirety of traffic? Because if you buy any Tesla or any self-driving vehicle, they care about you, safety. They care about your ride, okay, getting you to where you want to go, where you are to where you want to go. But so far, there is not much attempt to actually optimize the entirety of traffic. So it's very selfish in some ways. And because the V2V communication is absolutely not there today, and because the cell phone network is very crappy, the best you can do if you're trying to coordinate at the present time is to assume that you can do a lot of computing in the back end, also reminiscent to the air traffic control infrastructure. So planning and control, lots of control in the back end, and then ship at very low bandwidth, maybe high latency, some high-level speed plans. So think of the equivalent of an air traffic control gives very few verbal to the pilot. It's very small in size, and then all the control is done on board. And the idea is that if you ship the right information and the onboard control enables coordination, then maybe you can improve traffic. And so in the next 15 minutes of the talk, the color code I'm using is red as some level of automation, not necessarily level 5, could be lower. Blue is what the red can see or sense or knows. So if this car is in front of this guy, the LiDAR or radar will see it, the camera will see it. If it happens to be from the same fleet and it's here, it'll know because they'll correspond. And in some cases, there's regular people, my car, your car, and then the red doesn't know about it. So the idea is, what kind of algorithm can you run on the reds, so that with information from the blues and no knowledge of the whites, the whole flow is better. So now we're in 2016, and this is the first revolution of AI, and now deep reinforcement learning becomes the thing of the moment. And so then it becomes clear that these types of problems that one would have thought of historically as optimal control problems could be solved a lot more efficiently by deep reinforcement learning and libraries that came along. But just like Facet at the time, at that time, Facet or similar software were not running on the cloud. And the micro-SIM I was showing, they were also not running on the cloud. So you still had to build your stack of infrastructure, and then you had to run your optimizer on that stack, which really sucked. And in some ways, which really hindered progress at the time. And so just like Facet and all these software, the issue is that you can have super precise aircraft simulator with a 16 degree of freedom Atkin model and all kinds of other crazy equations. And then, of course, if you're doing maybe tens of thousands of aircraft, you cannot afford to have such models, or at least you could not. I think now you can, but you couldn't at the time. And then if you do the entire airspace of a region, so here's a city, it's on the ground, then it becomes harder and harder. And so we were lucky in the context of micro simulation, which is really the equivalent of Facet in the world of traffic, that in 2017, three technologies converged. First, deep reinforcement learning libraries came along. Really famous folks at Berkeley came up with RLib, RLab, and lots of different libraries, open source. Then Sumo came along, which was the first really sound micro-simulation tool. And then, of course, AWS was just starting. So this is when the time when you could start to get cloud time. And so we were the first in the world to actually integrate these three things together on a single platform. And we did it also with MSUN, which is a commercial product that is owned by Siemens, so we could do both a product and just open source framework. And so that's how we started looking very interestingly at traffic models and figure out, can we completely leapfrog the literature in that field, which is going to happen in aviation also very likely in the decade to come. So this happened in the last decade for the ground modes, and this is likely going to happen in the next decade with aviation. So first traffic models of vehicles go back to 1935. That's Bruce Greenfield in Ohio, and that's the first historical measurement of a traffic jam ever. There was some kind of a agricultural festival, so probably a couple hundred people came with their car. It was a small road, they plugged it. It was like, wow, cool, a traffic jam, they recorded it. Many decades later, an interesting experiment was run in Japan by the group of Sugiyama, in which they asked people like you and me to just drive on a circle and hold your distances. And of course, after 30 seconds, it's chaos because there's a few things humans are good at. So this is not one thing that humans are good at. Okay, it's a very simple task, right? But we're not good at that. And the reason is there's an underlying instability called jammetons or phantom jams that essentially propagates and amplifies. And you've seen this on the freeway every day. You brake, and then the guys behind you brake even harder, and the one behind even harder, and so on and so forth. So fast forward another 10 years, and a former student of mine, Dan Work, who is now at Illinois, does this experiment. And now we are in the late 2010, so the 17-ish is when they did it. And they inserted a vehicle in that circle, and the vehicle is driven by a human right now. So you see these waves propagating. I apologize, this is choppy. But at some point, the arrow is going to turn red. And when the arrow turns red, which it just did, then they show that with a very simple controller, explicit expert algorithm, they can smooth the oscillations. So that was eye-opening because this is one of the first time in the history of vehicles, of ground vehicles, that a self-driving vehicle, which in that case is just longitudinal control, is able to control human-driven vehicles. So think about the impacts of this in the airspace later. But this was eye-opening because that saved 40% fuel across all the vehicles. It's not a model, it's actual measurements from the vehicles. So one single AV is able to save across the board 40% of fuels. The algorithm was very simple full stopper algorithm they came up with, but that was brilliant. 1 year later, Kathy Wu, who is a former student of mine also, who is a professor at MIT, comes up with this simulation, where again, they implement in simulation, I emphasize on Sumo, an example of, sorry for the stroboscopic effect online, it's probably hard to see, where these waves happen again. And at some point, when you turn on the autopilot, it regulates it. So now you're probably wondering, well, if they did an experiment in 2017, why would I show something numerical done in 2018? And the main difference is that the previous experiment modeled all the vehicles, had knowledge of how many vehicles in the ring, everything, all the dynamics. This is black box deep reinforcement learning. This is a policy running on the red vehicle. I know they're going backwards because of stroboscopic effect. That's weird. But essentially, the red vehicle has no idea how many cars are on the ring. All it knows is the blue car in front of it, and all it knows is the reward in terms of fuel consumption of the whole thing. And so, within essentially 2 years, so this leapfrog probably half a century of experimental work, and this leapfrog probably 10,000 publications on model-based control, because now you could do it with black box deep reinforcement learning. So then the students try to generalize this to a variety of settings. So if you do 2 cars, if you do 2 lanes and you want to stabilize a double ring, all you need to do is to behave like a jerk and essentially switch back and forth to prevent the guys behind to pass you, and that stabilizes the touring. Now, I'm telling this to you as a kind of a funny story. The thing is, the deep reinforcement learning figured it out on his own. Like, he discovered jerk behavior to stabilize a double ring. And you could say, well, what's the big deal? You do learn this in police academy, and it's true. That's called a snail operation. Or in my country, when we do strikes, that's our national sport. You do this on every freeway of the nation, so you can paralyze the country. But it's interesting because then with this reinforcement learning framework, a lot of emergent behavior. Oh, this is cool. You can see reactions of people. You ever seen this before? Hey, okay, thank you. Whoever's doing this, thanks. Keep doing this. Good spirit. Okay, and so this is an example. This is the worst way to manage an intersection. I really apologize for people online, and even in the room, it's kind of choppy. I don't know why, but this is the worst way of managing an intersection because everybody stops. So everybody burns more gas, stops. It's really bad. And so here, if you do the same algorithm, it's pretty cool. What it's doing is it's figuring out the right speed at which you do a snake that is half of the length of the 8-figure. Now, I just told this to you again as a CNN story, but the point is that this was also discovered by the deep reinforcement learning algorithm without any knowledge of the model. So we continue doing this further and further. This is another example of a managed intersection here where some cars do this, some cars do that. So I don't really know who's doing what, but you're trying to maximize the throughput here. And then I really cannot tell you, unless I'm a really good car dealer or carpet dealer or something, what it's doing. So every once in a while, the red car is stopping, it's building a little queue that is releasing the queue. So at that point, the deep reinforcement learning has found a solution that's not really explainable, nor even understandable, but clearly improves the metric that you're trying to optimize. So and then we push this even further, like you train the cars in simulation on the ring, and then you deploy them on the road where they have not been before. So typical way to create a traffic jam happens in your neighborhood probably many hours a day. You just keep pushing cars onto an on-ramp, and this will create a back propagating queue. I'm sure you've seen that before. You can see the queue is propagating. Again, sorry for the quality of movie on the screen. And then, so in the case of regulation by vehicles, what you will see is that every once in a while, there's a red vehicle that is injected here, and that red vehicle will essentially at some point stop. So you taught the car to become a traffic light, essentially, and the car will just stop, like it's doing now, and wait so that it doesn't have later to reaccelerate, because if you look at the fuel consumption of that maneuver, it's actually better. And the cool thing is it did not learn it on the road. It actually learned it on the ring. So it's kind of an interesting case of transfer learning.
You're assuming the humans won't go around the stuff.
And you're assuming that people obey by the traffic law, which is not a given in every country. Plead guilty being a French citizen. Okay, so at some point we were really happy enough that we thought the time has come to go to the real world. And so we started being interested in these phantom jams that happen on these freeways for no reason. Like take your typical 101 here in our backyard. 101 will probably carry 2,000 vehicles per hour per lane. But if you are at 1,500, it's going to start to experience these waves because of the fact that we're very poor drivers. So there's no reason for this to happen, these traffic jams. It's just people are not efficient. They're not good drivers. That's all. This is not a capacity problem. It's really a behavioral problem. And so we decided to move our work to platforms. So first, we looked at the I-210 testbed I mentioned before and figured out if we could do a deployment in California. I'm sorry, again, it looks like random pictures because of the sampling of the screen. But if you were looking at my screen, what you would see is car going really fast. And at some point, there's a big congestion waves that clogs that window here. And these waves are now propagating back and forth. And then in about 10 seconds, some cars are going to turn blue. And when that happens, that means that essentially the red cars are turned on the algorithm we trained in deep learning, and they are going to start smoothing the traffic. And again, sorry for the stroboscopic effects here. And when that happens, you can demonstrate the variance goes very low, and then the fuel consumption is greatly decreased, and the throughput doesn't change because we don't want to change the throughput. That's not the goal here. It's happening now, but again, not very visible on the movie. So then we decided to go to hardware. So first, not very ambitious, small toys you can buy in a store. This is Feng Yu Wu, who is now at Columbia University, and Eugene Vinitsky, who is a professor at NYU. Now, and they were students at the time. Then we worked with people at the University of Delaware to demonstrate the same algorithms on things that are a little bit more challenging. So here, the blue cars are able to run the deep reinforcement learning algorithm, and they're sequencing, just like aircraft, they're sequencing cars on the roundabout. And you can see in the reinforcement learning version of it, the Hummer, which is the last vehicle to exit the thing, will actually exit before the last car here is exit the roundabout. So you can think about this as a distributed policy an air traffic controller would use to sequence aircraft and minimize the arrival time of the last aircraft. And Kathy Jang now works at Waymo, and as I mentioned, Eugene works at NYU. So at that point we were ready, and so we decided, okay, they did one car control. Then they had done a really set of cool experiments where they went to the dealer and got 8 different brands, put the autopilots on, and then started to see what happens. And the last person in the chain is crazy, was oscillating between something like 60 miles an hour, 20 miles an hour, when the first one was driving smoothly, showing that if you have a bunch of people turning cruise control on the freeway and they're not collaborative, it's literally like a French accordion. So then they had done that experiment. So we decided, okay, can we do a 10-car experiment where we go to a single stretch of freeway? We don't tell people what we're doing. We tell the police, of course, we tell the Department of Transportation, but we don't tell drivers what we're doing. And essentially, we're trying to see, can we control a single lane with a few vehicles? So we chose a site in Nashville, Tennessee, because my former student at work is at Vanderbilt, and he has he built a $15 million test bed that I'll show in a minute to instrument the freeway. So it was a perfect place to experiment. And it's also a terrible freeway. There's an accident almost every hour. I've seen people walking on that freeway. I've seen all kinds of weird stuff happen on that freeway. And so the first experimental scenario was, okay, why don't we put just a bunch of vehicles on a single lane, and using the same color as before, 4 controlled vehicles, 6 probe vehicles, just measuring things because we weren't sure it would work. And then a bunch of people who drive crazy, they switch lanes, they come in between, they do a bunch of different things. And we ran that test in the middle of COVID. The police was amazing. They helped us enter the freeway in funeral style, you know, so yeah, 1 car in the front, one, so then people don't really mess up with the initial order. After that, we're on our own. And then it's like when you go surfing, you hope to have good waves. Okay, so when you do this, you hope to have good congestion. And then we were able to catch 2 waves roughly at every ride. And what's really cool is that in that first experiment, we saved 16% of fuel on our own vehicles. And then but we were able to see what was happening behind. And so even the person behind us, we have no idea who they were, they saved 14%, because if you have someone like us who is driving very smoothly and you can't pass them, you have to kind of mimic their behavior. Of course, the effect decreases the further away from the control vehicle, but it was really cool that we could show that even with a small number of vehicles, locally, we were saving a lot of energy. So then that's when we built that hierarchical layer. You can see this is a car version of, in some ways, what's happening in air traffic control. You file a flight plan. That's like we call this speed planner. And then, of course, you do your local control when you're in the cockpit. Or if you're a drone, you do it with your local sensing. And so we built an entire architecture to support that multi-vehicle control approach for the cars. Where instead of ETMS data or ADS-B data, essentially on the road, there's something you can buy that's called INRIX. And that's essentially what we use to feed our planning layer. And all the planning layer does is it essentially provides a form of a flight plan to a car. So it tells a car, this is your speed target. So exactly like an air traffic control would tell you, climb to this floor and reduce your speed to this, or climb to that floor and then go to cruise altitude, and so on and so forth. But here it would be essentially the version of that for the cars. And then remember, very crappy cellular networks. Then once the flight plan is essentially produced at the planning layer, just like the ATC will grab the mic and just tell instructions to the pilot, well, they'll send a message, which will be a text message to the connected device in the car, and then the car will go straight to the autopilot stack. And so this is what the shock waves look like. This is time, this is space. This is the data you ingest. So for example, if this is 5 o'clock, then when you're controlling the car at 5:05, all you have access is the previous data. And the beauty of this is that now this is about 2019, 2020. That's when we did that. Super vanilla flavored deep learning algorithm can separate shock waves from stop and go waves. Shock waves is like there's something stopped or occlusion on the freeway. And then stop and go waves is what you want to shave. So ideally that you can't change because there's stuff on the freeway, but that you can shave if you are able to. And so then another student of mine, Je Fu, who is finishing her PhD now, came up with an interesting set of algorithms for speed planning, which is the equivalent of, if you will, automated flight plan generation, but for cars. And so typically for that, they would provide things that are very intuitive. What humans would do typically is they would slow down and oscillate and then speed up, which is bad. Instead, what the math would say is that you do this blue thing, and because it's not socially acceptable when nobody's in front of you to drive too slowly on the freeway, you'd have to clip it because we've been horned before, we've been insulted before, we've been yelled at, shown fingers, and a bunch of other things. So you have to do an algorithm which provides some socially acceptable outcome. And again, in air traffic control, we know that's the case too, right? You can't just fly wild and not comply to rules. And so typically, so this is the type of things you would do is like transform the INRIX type of speed profiles into something a car would drive much more smoothly, and therefore enhance the smoothness of the entire traffic flow, and therefore improve the overall fuel efficiency of the thing. So we implemented this on our own cloud in Nashville, Tennessee. So all the algorithms I'm telling you, the planning layer, it all runs on AWS. And then all the local algorithms, I'll tell you in a minute, they run, of course, on the vehicles because that you cannot ship. It's not going to work. And of course, because we were running on different vehicles, so Toyotas, GMs, and Nissans, each of them has a different architecture, different stack, different sensing. So the algorithms are different. And I mean, now we're talking deep reinforcement learning, very simple algorithm that can learn from a variety of ways. So for example, we learned from the previous experiment on the ring because they had an expert algorithms. We learned from kernel smoothing. We use a lot of different ways to do imitation learning. And then of course, a little bit of reward shaping because it's, the best solution is the restops. That's how you get to zero energy, but that is not practical. So you have to do energy minimization while maintaining some form of throughput and minimizing variance. So it's a little bit of the garage work that is underlying typical deep reinforcement learning algorithms. And then safety filters, very important. Just like TCAS, you're flying an aircraft, you have TCAS on board. It makes you feel good, makes you sleep at night. So that's our TCAS, if you will. And then the car itself has another set of layers to make sure that it's safe. You can't prove it. Okay, that's a big question mark. It works. You can prove statistically it works on some experimental data, but it's hard to prove that it works formally. But in practice, it works really well. So this is a typical example of a trajectory of a real person. So very bumpy. And this is a trajectory of a real AV, so our vehicles. And you can see it's a kind of a same thing, a little bit delayed because it's behind, and of course, much smoother, which is exactly what you're trying to achieve. So we did, then we had to do it for 100 vehicles because we went to the Department of Transportation and say, how many, and Department of Energy, how many vehicles do you need to show us it works in reality? So we said 100, it was a good number, I like 100. And so we essentially got ourselves a really nice test bed that my student done work with a professor at Vanderbilt built for us on the I-24 in Nashville, Tennessee. So this, I don't know if I can click on it. No, it doesn't. Okay. Well, anyway, he built every 500 meters this gigantic poles with high-res video camera data that today produces the largest data set in the world. This is the best instrumented freeway in the world. And here we go. And so this is a few years ago when they started building it. He worked very closely with the Tennessee Department of Transportation and the city of Nashville. And our experiment was the first to run on the testbed, but the idea is much, much longer time scale. The idea is they're going to fully close the loop on the infrastructure. And again, thinking about air traffic control, the notion of closing the loop with humans in the loop, but closing the loop on the infrastructure is something that in the context of freeway is not science fiction, because essentially video cameras now have enough resolution to see every car with a very high degree of precision, and then cloud computing enables computations so that you can do things in real time, which was not the case when we started the project 10 or 15 years ago. And so then we rented a factory, and then we assembled a team of about 200 people for a couple of months, initially 50, and then we go to 200. And the idea is that self-driving cars don't come out of the factory and we can use it. Like, it's very hard. We can't work with Tesla. Tesla is not going to partner. So we instead got 100 vehicles from Nissan. And they let us open every vehicle and build our own radios and our own infrastructure in it, so we could control the cars with consent of the driver, of course. And so for weeks and months, students built these. So we had like shifts in this kind of factory, and we built the infrastructure. They taught us how to open the cars, things I've never done before, to just unplug cables, plug our stuff instead. So we also had all the cars on the parking lot for a while as we were building the hardware for the experiments. We installed our own internet so we could ship algorithms literally sometimes 5 times a day because you don't want to just plug something in the car, just want to ship the algorithm directly to the car. And then it's not glamorous, but that's a Raspberry Pi, and that's really all you need to interface with ROS, which is the operating system of the car. So we almost like had an airport type of display where you could see in real time which car has what algorithm, and we would just every night upload all the algorithms. So the next test would start the next morning around 5 a.m., which is when congestion starts to build on the freeway. Challenging part was to recruit drivers. You have to pay people a lot to come to weird place at 5 a.m. So that means they have to arrive at 4 to drive back and forth on the freeway for a couple hours. So all of us had to do some recruitment. My proudest recruitment is I recruited the girlfriend of my Uber driver. But we went to the bus terminal, to the airport, to the dining halls, and we had 700 volunteers. And after you do background checks, police checks, all that stuff, well, there's 150 left, and that's what you need to run a 100-car experiment. So then in the morning, we would come and would brief them on what they have to do, and what they have to do is very simple. So essentially, all they had to do is, when driving the car, push the little onion button. That's what the autopilot looks like on the Nissan Rogue. And if anything feels weird, disengage, brake, it will disengage. Otherwise, just imagine you're driving, it's your typical cruise controller, except it's not. It's our algorithm instead. So, but to the driver, the driver has no experience. It's not a professional driver. It's someone who works at the cashier at Target. It's someone who is a medical assistant, someone who is a retired person. Lots of retired person who are just eager to just do things. So to them, the interface has to be super basic. And the super basic is just push. Imagine this is your cruise controller. Anything uncomfortable, disengage, don't worry about it. So we run that experiment. And we give them a kind of a scannable Google code that essentially send them on an infinite loop until they're tired, and then they could come and change, and we would switch and rotate drivers and with special instructions. And that's how we achieved roughly 1% of the vehicle penetration on that freeway in some places. That means if you're running 100 cars back and forth and you time them well, in some places you have about 1% of the people, and we believe that was enough to control traffic. So at the time we had 100 Rogues, 5 Toyota RAV4s. Of course, everyone wants to drive this one because it's much more comfortable. And we only had one of them, courtesy of GM Tel Aviv in Israel. And essentially then we run things like an airport. So in the morning at 5 a.m., we just launch all the vehicles. And then we keep doing this through congestion throughout the day. We rotate drivers. Essentially, we're running an airline, except they're not flying. We had lots of fun things. So this is the data. This gives you a sense of the data. So this is where it gets really interesting, right? So this data could not be collected probably 10 years ago. It's just and even now, when we collect all the data, we can see every lane, every 500 meters, very, very high resolution. We can only store 15 days of data. After that, we run out of space. So it's like massive. It's a monster testbed. I mean, Dan is a genius. He's the guy who built it. There's no other freeway in the world that has that level of data. And to give you a sense of, so these are trajectories. So this is downsampled video image location in space of a vehicle and indicated by color. So you can see these cars are going really fast in green, and then slower in red, and then fast. And then these white vehicles are the self-driving vehicles. And then the fact that cars cross each other means that there's different lanes, and I'm showing you all the data for all the lanes together. So this is called a time space diagram. The first one invented in history was in 1960, and they had 16 data points over maybe 20 data points. Okay. I have the picture, I can show it to you later. And just to give you a sense of the magnitude here, it's completely crazy. I'm just zooming out and out and out. Throughout the 4 or 5 hours span, you can see all these stop and go waves, and you can see these wide trajectories, which are locally smoothing traffic. 1% is not enough to kill it. So otherwise it would all be green, and that's impossible. And that's also socially very, very complicated. But what we wanted to demonstrate is that without being noticed, nobody really figured out that we were doing, except when helicopters started to fly around us because they figured out there's something weird, and the TV crews showed up with cameras. But other than that, nobody figured out what we were doing. And nevertheless, when you look inside the data, we have savings in fuel, which locally are up to 10%. So it worked really well. And the way to measure that is typically what you look is at the variance between velocity acceleration plot. So if you plot for every vehicle speed and acceleration, typically you want to be at zero acceleration and a big patch of speed. But instead, in reality, because you've been in traffic, you go fast, then you go slow, then you go fast. Essentially, you're just alternating between these two clusters. And what we could demonstrate statistically is that we can reduce the convex hull of the 90th percentile of this distribution by essentially bringing the two potatoes closer together. And that is enough to save locally up to 10% of traffic, which on a freeway lane that can carry up to 2,000 vehicles an hour is actually a lot of fuel. And it's kind of intuitive what it does, because if you compare the distribution of speed ahead of the AV statistically to behind of the AV, ahead of the AV, you'll have essentially a pocket of very low speeds. That's because people who are not smooth by an AV, they go fast, they go slow, they go fast, they go slow. So there's a cluster of slow points. And what it does is it just smooths it out. So behind the AV, there is not, it's not as big. You can see it's smoothed out, which means there's less behind an AV. There's less people that go slow statistically because they tailgate the AV at a lower speed. So it's much more efficient. Okay, and we could prove that the savings are great, and then of course the further behind the AV, the less savings there is. So now going back to air traffic control, once we finished that test in 2022, then LLM came along, and then suddenly it became possible to speak to vehicles. So what we wanted to test immediately, because we were thinking maybe now is a good time to go back to aviation, is can we actually ask an LLM to explain to us what we did? So the idea was that we would give an LLM the outcome of the algorithm, or even the structure of the algorithm, and we would ask the LLM to narrate what it did. And I don't know if you can hear the sound.
Approximately 56.4 miles per hour, which appears stable with a slight drift in relative velocity over the past few seconds. The flow and mode controller is engaged, as indicated by the value of 5 in the DCC Cruz _state_int_ data.
Okay, so it's equally exciting as YouTube videos narrated by AI. But the point of this is that essentially the LLM, we trained the LLM and in different ways, with RAG in particular, and the LLM was actually able to tell us what we did, either by looking at the code and saying, oh, if you have this value, then the variance is that much. The variance is known to be bad for fuel consumption because of this. It figured it out. And then it's also able to tell us why it's slowing down. Why is it slowing down? Because there's something ahead and it detects it. And that gave us, so this was of course very early when suddenly everyone was waking up and doing these very early associations of LLMs. Of course, now there's lots of people. Now you can essentially tell your car, go and pick up my son at school and please don't drive over 30 miles an hour. And the car will do it. I mean, with a few caveats, but that's not even science fiction anymore. But so why does it matter to the context of aviation, and why am I interested in returning to aviation after so many years? And why have we returned to aviation? Something we're doing with Crown, with Karen, with Tom. Tom, I know you're online somewhere. Hello. And with Jordan Kam, who is both working at NASA and many other people, is because I think this is also a game changer for air traffic management. So if we go back to 25 years ago in this building, or 20 years ago in this building, we used to think about the aviation world and traffic management as a control system, which it still is. But if we think about this in the context of tokenization and LLM, the idea would be, well, that system here, that slide from my PhD thesis from George Meyer's office here on the second floor a couple years ago, couple decades ago. In some ways, if we think of it as a sampling of traffic over time, the modern version of control, okay, so heavily relying hopefully on LLM, would rely on tokenization. So it's a very fundamental question that Crown and us at Berkeley are working on, which is how can we define a tokenized framework that can support, and hi Vish, we're just looking at your work, that can support that. And so the idea is that tokenization is not obvious, right? Because think of all of these aircraft. I mean, is it better to tokenize in terms of modes? Is it better to tokenize in terms of flight segments? Is it better to tokenize, don't take pictures. Just kidding. Tokenize ADSB. What would you tokenize? And so this is exactly the type of open problems that we are very excited to work on. And because sooner or later, that will become a new modeling framework that can be used for a variety of different ways, especially, so of course, the idea is you could throw everything out of the kitchen sink at it and take a big LLM like Llama and then put in the LOAs, put in all the VFR charts, you know, everything, okay? That's one way to do it. Unclear what could work, or you could also think maybe there is some form of mapping between audio and ADS-B, and that's where the work we're doing here with you and people in Code A would be really exciting, because if you can start to have that mapping, then just like people are talking to their cars, there is a different way to think about the future of aviation and digitalization of voice and how that translates into multiple vehicle control. And so Daryl, who is one of our high school interns, and Jordan Kam, who is online and who is one of our star students in the aerospace program cohort 1 at Berkeley, have come up with early frameworks that merge all of this data and that we really think will be transformational for something that is my last point today, which is AirLink. AirLink is a concept, so I'm going to just skip because we have very little time now, but AirLink is a concept that as the founding associate provost of the Berkeley Space Center and my successor, Victoria Coleman, now very strongly endorsed, which is, air travel in the Bay Area will happen in the next 10 years in forms that have not happened before. eVTOL of some form, drone of some form. Whether everybody takes their helicopter in the morning to grab a cappuccino at the local Starbucks and go to work, no, that's not the future. But clearly, these new forms of transportation are already changing in a lot of places in the world. So the Berkeley Space Center being at NASA Ames and with buildings we'll build ourselves with possibly vertiports on the roof or the helipad at the end of the runway close to the Google buildings. I mean, this could be the precursor of connections between a variety of landing points in the Bay Area, including Berkeley at the Richmond Field Station, where we have a helipad ourselves. So Jordan and Matthias Casanova and Etienne Casanova, who are two other high school volunteers, one of which is now at Caltech in aerospace, started flying these routes in studying these routes that could connect us. And I'll be done in 2 minutes. I see you're standing up, so I'm getting really nervous. But I promise I have only 3 slides. And so they started flying up, maybe 5. And so they started flying these routes and figuring out altitude charts. And this is where it's very interesting to connect with NAMS-2, because when you fly these routes, you will cross class Bravo, Charlie, and even many more classes of airspace. The procedures might change. If you fly autonomously, you might have to do this or that. And so this is in some ways turning to be a gigantic design problem where collectively this group could be really influential in shaping the future of that low altitude airspace where procedures are still to be defined, where a lot of constraints force you to fly over very specific sets of land or water at specific set of altitudes. And so in some ways the experiments have already started. So it's nice to have students who can also fly planes. But also I think what we're really looking at for the future, and that would be maybe the video I use for the questions, is now that we have launched the Berkeley Space Center 3 years ago, and now that we see that eVTOL is not science fiction anymore, not even piloted and not even IC, the notion is that we could use the different UCs, Berkeley, Davis, Merced, and Santa Cruz, their airports, their landing points, to start seeing how we could experiment changing in some ways and designing procedures in that airspace, and in particular in light of the fact that with the tools that we see emerging now in machine learning, it's maybe much easier to do in some ways than it used to be before. And so I think that's going to be my last lecture. I want to say again, it's super exciting to be here after almost 30 years in this building. Thank you, Crown and Karen and Tom and everybody for the invitation, and hopefully many more years of aviation work now that we're back at NASA. Thank you.
Yeah. So I'm going to thank you with a little token of our NAMS-edness. We're running late. Is there a burning question that we can answer? Or I'm sure Alex will be here after the talk. Yes.
Fascinating talk. Thank you very much. I just wonder, all of these analogs between the car domain and the air traffic, the one that you didn't mention was the convective weather, for example, or weather in general. So how do you go about that as to density of weather, where maybe in traffic is not so prevalent?
No, it's a very good point. And maybe a prelude answer and then a specific answer. So it's interesting. The reason why we did this first with cars, obviously it's so much easier to do with cars in contained environments. Now, specific to the weather problem in traffic it's not fully deterministic, but it's certainly more on the deterministic side than the stochastic part. And here's why. It's inherently one-dimensional, and you can show that under rain, the capacity goes down by that much. Under fog by that much, with sun facing you, it goes that much. So in some ways, these things are fairly well understood. And unlike the air traffic, where it's very complicated because you have to navigate around, you have to climb, you have to descend, and there's all kinds of chain reactions. The weather problem in traffic is essentially a 1.5 dimensional network. It's a 1.5 dimensional system. It's like 1D links that connect. So the back propagation is much easier. In air traffic control, it's much harder. I do remember from being in this building. I have seen early articles of people using LLMs in weather. So I think that it's not crazy that you could, I don't think you can learn the weather, but I think that predictive model of Navier-Stokes' equation are now already overtaken by just simple deep neural nets. So I think it's not crazy that you could augment your LLM to have a weather layer. I'm not sure it's going to do everything, but I think it could probably help with some of the typical things we would do as an optimization program. That's a guess. We should work on this together.
All right, thank
So
you.
I have, sorry.
Okay, go on.
Sorry. You could insert highway police, right? They could do this regulation. Instead of having it automated, if you have a screen, tells them slow down, speed up, then this would be an immediate.
Yeah, actually Waymo will do it sooner or later. It's interesting, actually. When I started the project, I thought the police could do it with the proper automation. And I think in 5 years, whoever is running an automated vehicle, whether it's Waymo or others, they will have to do it because sooner or later that'll be regulated. And the analogy is, think about horse carriages and then cars, and then someone invented a traffic light. And then someone came at the intersection at midnight and was like, what is this useful for? There's nobody. But it's the same, but that's because we were regulating infrastructure. So it's the same. It's like first, like, oh, why would you use a Waymo to regulate traffic until it becomes a problem and Waymo has to regulate itself and regulate everybody. So Waymo is a generic, not just them specifically.
Interesting. Well, thank you so very kindly. Sorry to cut it off, but I'm sure you'll be here to answer more questions. But I want to put in a small advertisement for next week's seminar, which is the title will be Advanced Air Mobility Tools for System Analysis and Design Integration with Regional Transportation. And that will be presented by Professor Raja Sengupta. So anyway, we look forward to seeing you here again next week. Thank you all so much.